Chapter 8 of Beyond the Rocks, a Love Story by Elinor Glyn. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Reading by Amy Deutschler. Theodora hummed to herself a glad little chansonnette as she changed her breakfast negligee for the freshest and loveliest of her spring frocks. She did not know why she was so happy. There had been no word of anyone else being of the party, only she and Mrs. McBride, but Versailles would be exquisite on such a day, and something whispered to her that she might not yawn. The most radiant vision awaited the widow, when, with unusual punctuality, her automobile stopped at the hotel door. She came in. She was voluble, she flattered Josiah. So good of him to take Mr. Tubbs, and she hoped it would not tire him. Theodora should be well looked after. They might be late and even dine at Versailles, she said, and Mr. Brown was not to be anxious. She would be responsible for the safe return of his beautiful little wife. Theodora was 5'7" at least, but her small head and extreme slenderness gave people the feeling she was little, something to be protected and guarded always. Josiah was affable. Mrs. McBride's words were so smooth and so many, he had no time to feel Theodora was going to dine out without him, or that anything had been arranged for ultimate ends. The automobile had reached Suresnes before the widow said to her guest, "Your father and Lord Bracondale have promised to meet us at the reservoirs. Captain Fitzgerald told me how you wanted to go to Versailles, and how your husband is not strong enough to take these excursions, so I thought we might have this little day out there, while he is engaged with Mr. Clutterbuck Tubbs." "How sweet of you," said Theodora. As they rushed through the smiling country, both women's spirits rose, and Mrs. McBride's were the spirits of experience, and did not mount without due cause. Since she had been a girl in Dakota and passionately in love with her first husband, the defunct McBride was a second venture. She had not met a man who could quicken her pulse like Captain Fitzgerald. It was a curious coincidence that they both had already two partners to regret. It was an extra link between them, and Jane McBride, who was superstitious, read the omen to mean that this time each had met his true mate. "If he is irresistible today, I think I shall clinch matters," she was saying to herself, while Theodora's musings ran, "How beautiful Versailles will look, and I dare say he will know all about its history and be able to tell me interesting things, and oh, I am so glad I put on this frock, and oh, I am so happy." And aloud they spoke of paradise plumes and the new gray, and the merits and demerits of Callot and Doucet and Jean Valet. And the widow said some bright American things about husbands and the world in general that conveyed crisp truths. The drive seemed all too short, and there were their two cavaliers in the courtyard awaiting them at the reservoirs, having arrived just before them. To the end of her life Theodora will remember that glorious May day. Its even minutest detail, the color of the chestnut trees, the tint of the sky, the scent in the air, every line of his figure and turn of his head, every look in his eyes, and they were many and varied, and also, and alas, every growing emotion in her own heart. But at the moment all was gladness and exquisite young, irresponsible joy, sans arrière-pensée or disquieting reflection. She wondered which of the two men was the handsomer as she got out of the automobile, dear darling Papa or Lord Bracondale. Both were quite show creatures of their age, and both were of the same class and knowledge of savoir-vivre. Everyone said such polite and gracious things, it was all so smooth and gay, and it seemed so natural that they should take a turn up towards the chateau while breakfast was being prepared. 1:30 was time enough to eat, the widow said. "I want to show you a number of spots I love," Hector announced, choosing a different path to the other pair. "And it is a day we can be happy in, can't we?" "I want to be happy," said Theodora. "Then we shall go no farther now. We shall sit on this seat and admire the view. See, we are quite alone and undisturbed. All the world has gone home to breakfast." Then he looked at her, and though he really did try at this stage to be reasonable, something of the intense attraction he felt for her blazed in his eyes. She was sufficiently delectable a picture to turn the sagest head. There was something so absolutely pure white about that skin, it seemed good to eat, flawless, unlined, unblemished under this brilliant light. The way her silvery blonde hair grew was just the right way a woman's hair ought to grow, he thought, low on a high, broad brow, rippling and soft, and quantities of it. What could it be like to caress it, to run one's fingers through it, to bury one's face in it? Ah! And then there were her tender eyes, dewy and shadowed with dark lashes, and so intensely blue. His glance wandered further afield. Such a figure! Slender and graceful and fine. There was something almost childish about it all, the innocent look of a very young girl, with the polish of the woman garbed by an artist. It seemed the great pearls in her ears were not more milkily white than her throat, and he was sure were also her little slender hands that did not fidget but lay idly in her lap, holding her blue parasol. He would like to have taken off her gloves to see. Passionate devotion was surging up in his breast. And he was an Englishman, and it was still the morning. There was no moon now, and he had not even breakfasted. This shows sufficiently to what state he had come. "I want you to tell me all about Versailles," she said, looking to the left and the grey wing beyond the chapel. "Its histories and its meanings. I used to read about it all after Sarah brought me here once for our treat, but you probably are learned upon the subject, and I want to know." "I would much rather hear what you did when Sarah brought you here for your treat," he said. "Oh, it was a very simple day," and she leaned back and laughed softly at the recollection. "Papa was very hard up at that time, you know, and we were rather poor, so we came as cheaply as we could, Sarah Clementine and I, and I remember there were some very snuffy men in the train. We could not go first class, you see, and one of them rather frightened me." "The brute!" said Hector. "I think I was about 14. "And even then perfectly beautiful, I expect," he commented to himself. "We walked up from the station, and oh, we saw all the galleries, and we ran all over the park, but we missed the way to Trianon somehow, and never saw that, and when we got back here, we were too tired to start again. We had only had sandwiches, you see, that we brought with us, and some funny little drinks at a cafe down there," and she pointed vaguely towards the lake, "because we found we had only 1 franc 50 between us all. But we were so happy, and Clementine knows a great deal, and told us many things which were quite different from what was in the guidebooks. But it seems so long, long ago. Do you know, it must be 6 years." And she looked at him seriously. "Half a lifetime," agreed Hector, with a whimsical smile. "Oh, you are laughing at me," she said, and there was a cloud in the blue stars which looked up at him. He made a movement nearer her, while his deep voice took every tone of tenderness. "Indeed, indeed I am not, you dear little girl. I love to hear of your day. I was only smiling to think that 6 years ago you were a baby child, and I was then an old man in feeling. Let me see, I was 25, and I was in Russia." He stopped suddenly. There were some circumstances which, sitting there beside her, he would rather not remember connected with Russia. This was one of the peculiarities of Theodora. There was something about her which seemed to wither up all low or vicious things. It was not that she filled people with ascetic thoughts of saints and angels and their mother in heaven, only she seemed suddenly to enhance simple joys with beauty and charm. They talked on for half an hour, and with every moment he discovered fresh qualities of sweetness and light in her gentle heart. She was not ill-educated either, but she had never speculated upon things. She took them for granted just as they were, and Jean de Grève was probably the only awakening book she had ever read. Hector all at once seemed to realize his mother's vision, and to understand for the first time what marriage might mean. That to possess this exquisite bit of God's finished work for his very own, to live with her in the country at Old Bracondale, to see her honored and adored, surrounded by little children, his children, would be a dream of bliss far, far beyond any dream he had ever known. A domestic, tender dream of sweetness that he had always laughed at before as a final thing when life's other joys should be over, and now it seemed suddenly to be the only heaven and completion of his soul's desire. Then he remembered Josiah Brown with a hideous pang of pain and bitterness, and they went in to lunch. Theodora was so gay. Captain Fitzgerald and Mrs. McBride were already seated when they joined them in the restaurant. Most of the other visitors had finished. It was almost 2:00. There was a good deal of black middle in the widow's eyes, Theodora noticed, and wondered to herself if she had had a happy and exciting hour too. Papa looked complacent and handsomer than ever, she thought. She did hope it was going well, and she wondered how they were to dispose of their afternoon. The widow soon settled this. She had, she said, a wild desire to rush through the air for a little. She must have her chauffeur go at full speed somewhere, anywhere. Her nerves needed calming. And Captain Fitzgerald had agreed to accompany her. Their destination was unknown, and they might not be back for tea, so Lord Bracondale must take the greatest care of Theodora and give her some if they did not turn up. They certainly would for dinner, but 8:00 would be time enough for that. When your destination is unknown, you can never say how many hours it will take to get there and back, she pointed out, and no one felt inclined to argue with her about this obvious truth. Now, if Theodora had been a free, unmarried girl, or a freer widow, it is highly probable fate would not have arranged this long afternoon in blissful surroundings undisturbed by anyone. As it was, who knows if the goddess settled it with a smile on her lip or a tear in her eye. It was settled at all events, and looked as if it were going to contain some moments worth remembering. End of chapter 8. Chapter 9 of Beyond the Rocks, a Love Story by Elinor Glyn. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Reading by Amy Deutschler. "And what is your pleasure, fair queen?" Hector said, as they listened to the diminishing noise of the widow's Mercedes. "We are alone, and we have the world before us. Issue your commands." No, said Theodora, and she pouted her red lips. I want you to settle that. I want you to arrange for whatever you think would give me the greatest pleasure. Then I shall know if you understand me and guess what I would like. This was the most daring speech she had ever made, and she was surprised at her own temerity. Very well, he said. That means you belong to me until they return. And a thrill ran through him. Has not your father, has not your hostess given you into my charge? And now you yourself have sealed the compact. We shall see if I can make you happy. As he said the words, you belong to me, Theodora thrilled too. A sensation as of an electric shock almost quivered through her. Belonged to him. Ah, what would that mean? He called his chauffeur, who started the automobile and drove under the covered porte-cochere where they stood. Lord Bracondale had not spoken all the time he was helping her in and arranging rugs with the tenderest solicitude, but when they were settled in and started, it was a coupe with a great deal of glass about it, so that they got plenty of air. He turned to her. Now, do you know what I am going to do with you, madam? I shall only unfold my plans bit by bit, and watch your face to see if I have chosen well. I am going to take you first to the Petit Trianon, and we are going to walk leisurely through the rooms. I am not going to worry you with much sightseeing and tourists and lessons of history, but I want you to glance at this setting of the life picture of poor Marie Antoinette, because it is full of sentiment, and it will make you appreciate more the Hameau and her playground afterwards. Something tells me you would rather see these things than all the fine pictures and salons of the stiff chateau. Oh, yes, said Theodora. You have guessed well this time. Then here we are, almost arrived, he said presently. They had been going very fast, and could see the square white house in front of them, and when they alighted at the gates she found the guardian was an old friend of Lord Bracondale's, and they were left free to wander alone in the rooms between the batches of tourists. But everyone knows the Petit Trianon, and can surmise how its beauties appealed to Theodora. Oh, the poor, poor Queen, she said, with a sad ring in her expressive voice when they came to the large salon. And she sat here and played on her harpsichord, and I wonder if she and Fenton were ever alone, and I wonder if she really loved him. Then she stopped suddenly. She had told herself she must never talk about love to anyone. It was a subject that she must have nothing to do with. It could never come her way now she was married to Josiah Brown, and it would be unwise to discuss it, even in the abstract. The same beautiful wild rose tint tinged the white velvet as once before when she had spoken of Jean de Greve, and again Lord Bracondale experienced a sensation of satisfaction. But this time he would not let her talk about the weather. The subject of love interested him, too. Yes, I am sure she did, he said. And I always shall believe Thurston was her lover. No life, even a queen's, can escape one love. I suppose not, said Theodora very low, and she looked out of the window. Love is not a passion which asks our leave if he may come or no, you see, Hector continued, trying to control his voice to sound dispassionate and discursive. He knew he must not frighten her. Love comes in 1,000 unknown, undreamed-of ways, and then he gilds the world and makes it into heaven. Does he? Almost whispered Theodora. And think what it must have been to be a queen, married to a tiresome, unattractive Bourbon, and Fersen was young and gallant and thoughtful for her slightest good, and, from what one hears and has read, he must have understood her, and been her friend as well, and sometimes she must have forgotten about being a queen for a few moments in his arms. Theodora drew a long, long breath, but she did not speak. And perhaps if we knew, the remembrance of those moments may have been her glory and consolation in the last dark hours. "Oh, I hope so," said Theodora. Then she walked on quickly into the quaint little low-ceilinged bedroom. Oh, she must get out into the air, or she must talk of furniture or certain stuffs or where the bath had been. Love, love, love! And did it mean life after all? Since even this far-off love of this poor dead queen had such power to move her, and perhaps Fersen was like— But this last thought caused her heart to beat too wildly. There were no roses now. She was very pale as she said, "It saddens me, this. Let us go out into the sun." They descended the staircase again almost in silence, and on through the little door in the courtyard wall into the beautiful garden beyond. "Show me where she was happy, where you know she was happy before any troubles came. I want to be gay again," said Theodora. So they walked down the path towards the hameau. "What have I done?" Lord Bracondale wondered. Her adorable face went quite white. Her soul is no longer the open book I have found it. There are depths and depths, but I must fathom them all. "Oh, how I love the springtime!" exclaimed Theodora, and her voice was full of relief. "Look at those greens, so tender and young, and that peep of the sky. Oh, and those dear pretty little dolls' houses. Let us hasten. I want to go and play there, and to make butter too, don't you?" "Ah, this is good," he said, "and I want just what you want." Her face was all sweet and joyous as she turned it to him. "Let's pretend we lived then," she said. "And I am the miller's daughter of this dear little mill, and you are the bailiff's son who lives opposite, and you have come with your corn to be ground. Oh, and I shall make a bargain and charge you dear." And she laughed and swung her parasol back while the sun glorified her hair into burnished silver. "What bargain could you make that I would not agree to willingly?" he asked. "Perhaps some day I shall make one with you, or want to, that you will not like," she said. "And then I shall remind you of this day and your gallant speech." "And I shall say then, as I say now, I will make any bargain with you, so long as it is a bargain which benefits us both." "Ah, you are a Normand, you hedge!" She laughed, but he was serious. They walked all around the laitery, and all the time she was gay and whimsical, and to herself she was saying, "I am unutterably happy, but we must not talk of love." "Now you have had enough of this," Lord Bracondale said, when they were again in view of the house. "And I am going to take you into a forest like the babes in the woods, and we shall go and lose ourselves and forget the world altogether. The very sight of these harmless tourists in the distance jars upon me today. I want you alone and no one else. Come." And she went. "I have never been here before," said Theodora, as they turned into the forest of Marley. "And you have been wise in your choice so far. I love trees." "You see how I study and care for the things which belong to me," said Hector. It gave him ridiculous pleasure to announce that sentence again, ridiculous, unwarrantable pleasure. Theodora turned her head away a little. She would like to have continued the subject, but she did not dare. Presently they came to a side allée, and after going up it about a mile, the automobile stopped, and they got out and walked down a green glade to the right. Oh, and I wonder if any of you who read know the Forest of Marley, and this one green glade that leads down to the center of a star where 5 avenues meet? It is all soft grass and splendid trees, and may have been a rendezvous de chasse in the good old days when life, for the great, was fair in France. It is very lonely now, and if you want to spend some hours in peace, you can almost count upon solitude there. Now, is not this beautiful? He asked her as they neared the center. And soon you will see why I carry this rug over my arm. I am going to take you right to the middle of the star until you see 5 paths for you to choose from, all green and full of glancing sunlight, and when you have selected one, we will penetrate down it and sit under a tree. Is it good, my idea? Very good, said Theodora. Then she was silent until they reached the Rond Point. There was that wonderful sense of aloofness and silence, hardly even the noise of a bird, only the green, green trees, and here and there a shaft of sunlight turning them into a shade of a lizard's back. An ideal spot for poets and dreamers and lovers, Theodora thought. Now we are here. Look this way and that. 5 paths for us to choose from. Then something made Theodora say, Oh, let us stay in the center, in this one round place, where we can see them all and their possibilities. And do you think uncertain possibilities are more agreeable, perhaps, than certain ends? He asked. I never speculate, said Theodora. As you will, then, he said, while he looked into her eyes, and he placed the rug up against a giant tree between 2 avenues, so that their view really only extended down 3 others now. We have turned our backs on the road we came, he said, and on another road that leads in a roundabout way to the Grand Avenue again. So now we must look into the unknown and the future. It seems all very green and fair, said Theodora, and she leaned back against the tree and half closed her eyes. He lay on the grass at her feet, his hat thrown off beside him, and in a desert island they could not have been more alone and undisturbed. The greatest temptation that Hector Bracondale had ever yet had in his life came to him then. To make love to her, to tell her of all the new thoughts she had planted in his soul, of the windows she had opened wide to the sunlight, to tell her that he loved her, that he longed to touch even the tips of her fingers, that the thought of caressing her lips and her eyes and her hair drove the blood coursing madly through his veins. That to dream of what life could be like, if she were really his own, was a dream of intoxicating bliss. And something of all this gleamed in his eyes as he gazed up at her, and Theodora, all unused to the turbulence of emotion, was troubled and moved and yet wildly happy. She looked away down the center avenue, and she began to speak fast with a little catch in her breath, and Hector clinched his hands together and gazed at a beetle in the grass, or otherwise he would have taken her in his arms. Tell me the story of all these avenues, she said. Tell me a fairy story suitable to the day. And he fell in with her mood. So he began. Once upon a time there was a fairy prince and princess, and a witch had enchanted them and put them in a green forest, but had set a watchdog over love, so that the poor Cupid with his bow and arrows might not shoot at them, and they were told they might live and enjoy the green wood, and find what they could of sport and joy. But Cupid laughed, as if, he said, there is anything in a green wood of good without me and my shafts. So while the watchdog slept, it was a warm, warm day in May, just such as this. He shot an arrow at the prince, and it entered his heart. Then he ran off laughing. That is enough for one day, he said. And the poor prince suffered, and suffered because he was wounded, and the princess had not received a dart too, and could not feel for him.
Was she not even sympathetic?
Asked Theodora, and again there was that catch in her breath. Yes, she was sympathetic, he continued, but this was not enough for the prince. He wanted her to be wounded too.
How very, very cruel of him, said Theodora.
But men are cruel, and the prince was only a man, you know, although he was in a green forest with a lovely princess.
And what happened?
Asked Theodora. Well, the watchdog slept on, so that a friendly zephyr could come, and it whispered to the prince, at the end of all these allées, which lead into the future, there is only one thing, and that is love. He bars their gates. As soon as you start down one, no matter which, you will find him, and when he sees your princess, he will shoot an arrow at her too.
Then the princess, of course, never went down an allée,
said Theodora, and she smiled radiantly to hide how her heart was beating.
Did she?
The end of the story I do not know, said Lord Bracondale. The fairy who told it to me would not say what happened to them, only that the prince was wounded, deeply wounded, with love's arrow. Aren't you sorry for the prince, beautiful princess? Theodora opened her blue parasol, although no ray of sunshine fell upon her there. She was going through the first moment of this sort in her life. She was quite unaccustomed to fencing, or to any intercourse with men, especially men of his world. She understood this story had himself and herself for hero and heroine. She felt she must continue the badinage, anything to keep the tone as light as it could be, with all these new emotions flooding her being and making her heart beat. It was almost pain she experienced. The sensation was so intense, and Hector read of these things in her eyes and was content. So he let his voice grow softer still, and almost whispered again, "And aren't you sorry for the prince, beautiful princess?"
"I am sorry for anyone who suffers," said Theodora gently, "even in a fairy story."
And as he looked at her, he thought to himself, here was a rare thing, a beautiful woman with a tender heart. He knew she would be gentle and kind to the meanest of God's creatures. And again the vision of her at Bracondale came to him. His mother would grow to love her, perhaps even more than Morella Winmarleigh. How she would glorify everything commonplace with those tender ways of hers. To look at her was like looking up into the vast, pure sky, with the light of heaven beyond. And yet he lay on the grass at her feet, with his mind full of thoughts and plans and desires to drag this angel down from her high heaven into his arms. Because he was a man, you see, and the time of his awakening was not yet. End of chapter 9. Chapter 10 of Beyond the Rocks, a love story by Elinor Glyn. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Reading by Amy Deutschler. Man is a hunter always. He may be a poor thing and hunt only a few puny aims, or he may be a strong man and choose big game
But he is hunting something always. And primitive life seems like the spectrum of light, composed of 3 primary colors, and white and black at the beginning and ending of it. And the 3 colors of blue, red, and yellow have their counterparts in the 3 great passions in man: to hunt his food, to continue his species, and to kill his enemy. And white and black seem like birth and death, and there is the sun, which is the soul and makes the colors and allows of all combinations and graduations of beautiful other shades from them for parallels to all other qualities and instincts. Only the original are those great primary forces: to hunt his food, to continue his species, and to kill his enemy. And if this is so to the end of time, man will be the same, I suppose, until civilization has emasculated the whole of nature and so ends the world. Or until this wonderful new scientist has perfected his researches to the point of creating human life by chemical process, as well as his present discovery of animating jellyfish. Who knows? But by that time it will not matter to any of us. Meanwhile, man is at the stage that when he loves a woman he wishes to possess her, and in a modified form he wishes to steal her, if necessary, from another, or kill the enemy who steals her from him. But the Son of Soul is there too, so the poor old world is not in such a very bad case after all. And how the bon Dieu must smile sadly to himself when he looks down on priests and nuns and hermits and fanatics, and sees how they have distorted his beautiful scheme of things with their narrow ideas, trying to eliminate the red out of his spectrum, instead of ennobling and glorifying it all with the sun of the soul. And all of you who are great reasoners and arguers will laugh at this ridiculous little simile of life drawn by a woman, but I do not care. I have had my outburst and said what I wanted to, so now we can get back to the 2 who were not yet lovers under their green tree in the forest of Marley. But you must be able to guess the end, Theodora was saying. And oh, I want to know if all the roads were barred by love. How did they get out of the wood? They took him with them, said Lord Bracondale, and he touched the edge of her dress gently with a wild flower he had picked in the grass, while into his eyes crept all the passion he felt, and into his voice all the tenderness. Now, if Theodora had ever read La Faute de l'Abbé Mouret, she would have known just what proximity and the springtime was doing for them both. But she had not read and did not know. All she was conscious of was a wild thrilling of her pulses, an extraordinary magnetic force that seemed to draw her nearer to what? Even that she did not know or ask herself. Beyond that it was danger, and she must fly from it. I do not want to talk of any of those things today, she said, suddenly dropping her parasol between them. I only want to laugh and be amused, and as you were to devise schemes for my happiness, you must amuse me. He looked up at her again, and he noticed, for all this brave speech, that her hands were trembling as she clutched the handle of her blue parasol. Triumph and joy ran through him. He could afford to wait a little longer now, since he knew that he must mean something, even perhaps a great deal, to her. And so for the next half hour he played with her. He skimmed over the surface of danger. He enthralled her fancy, and with every sentence he threw the glamour of his love around her, and fascinated her soul. All his powers of attraction, and they were many, were employed for her undoing. And Theodora sat as one in a dream. At last she felt she must wake, must realize that she was not a happy princess, but Theodora, who must live her dull life. And this, where was it leading her to? So she clasped her hands together suddenly, and she said, "But do you know we have grown serious, and I asked you to amuse me, Lord Bracondale." "I cannot amuse you," he said lazily, "but shall I tell you about my home, which I should like to show you some day?" And again he began to caress the farthest edge of her dress with his wild flower. Just the smallest movement of smoothing it up and down that no one could resent, but which was disturbing to Theodora. She did not wish him to stop, on the contrary, and yet, "Yes, I would like to hear of that," she said. "Is it an old, old house?" "Oh, moderately so, and it has nooks and corners and views that might appeal to you. I believe I should find them all endowed with fresh charm myself if I could see them with you." And he made the turning point of his flower a few inches nearer her hand. Theodora said nothing, but she took courage and peeped at him again, and she thought how powerful he looked and how beautifully shaped, and she liked the fineness of the silk of his socks and his shirt, and the cut of his clothes, and the wave of his hair, and last of all, his brown, strong, well-shaped hands. And then she fell to wondering what the general scheme of things could be that made husbands possess none of these charms, when if they did, it could all be so good and delicious, instead of a terribly irksome duty to live with them and be their wives. "You are not listening to a word I am saying," said Hector. "Where were your thoughts, cruel lady?" She was confused a little, and laughed gently. "They were away in a land where you can never come," she said. He raised himself on his elbow, and supported his head on his hand, while he answered eagerly, "But I must come. I want to know them all, your thoughts. Do you know that since we met on Monday, you have never been for one instant out of my consciousness, and you would not listen then to what I told you of friendship, when it is born of instantaneous sympathy. It is because in some other life two souls have been very near and dear. And that is our case, and I want to make you feel it so, as I do. Tell me that you do." "I do not know what I do feel," said Theodora. "But perhaps could it be true that we met when we lived before? And when was that? And who were we?" "It matters not a jot," said he, "so long as you feel it too, that we are not only of yesterday, you and I. There is some stronger link between us." For 1 second they looked into each other's eyes, and each read the other's thoughts mirrored there. And if his said in conscious, passionate words, "I love you," hers were troubled and misty with possibilities. Then she jumped up from her seat suddenly, and her voice trembled a little as she said, "And now I want to go out of the wood." He rose too and stood beside her, while he pointed to the glade to the left of the center they were facing. "We must penetrate into the future then," he said, "because I told my chauffeur to meet us on the road where I think that will lead to. We cannot go back by the way we have come." And she did not answer. She was afraid, because she remembered all those avenues were barred by love. As he walked beside her, Hector Bracondale knew that now he must be very, very careful in what he said. He must lull her fears to sleep again, or she would be off like a lark towards high heaven, and he would be left upon earth. So he exerted himself to interest and amuse her in less agitating ways. He talked of his home and his mother and his sister. He wanted Theodora to meet them. She would like Anne, he said, and his mother would love her, he knew. And again the impossible vision came to him, and he felt he hated the face of Morella Winmarleigh. Usually, when he had been greatly attracted by a married woman before, he had unconsciously thought of her as having the qualities which would make her an adorable mistress, a delicious friend, or a holiday amusement. There had never been any reverence mixed up with the affair, which usually had the zest of forbidden fruit, and was hurried along by passion. It had always only depended upon the woman how far he had got beyond these stages. But as he thought of Theodora, unconsciously a picture always came to him of what she would be were she his wife, and it astonished him when he analyzed it, he, the scoffer at bonds, now to find this picture the fairest in the world. And as yet he was hardly even dimly growing to realize that fate would turn the anguish of this desire into a chastisement of scorpions for him. Things had always been so within his grasp. "We shall go to England on Tuesday," Theodora said, as they sauntered along down the green glade. "It is so strange, you know, but I have never been there." "Never been to England?" Hector exclaimed, incredulously. "No," and she smiled up at him. All was at peace now in her mind, and she dared to look as much as she pleased. "No, Papa used to go sometimes, but it was too expensive to take the whole family, so we were left at Bruges generally, or at Dieppe, or where we chanced to be. If it was the summer, often we have spent it in a Normandy farmhouse." "Then how have you learned all the things you know?" he asked. "That was not difficult. I do not know much," she said gently, "and Sarah taught me in the beginning, and then I went to convents whenever we were in towns, and dear Papa was so kind and generous always. No matter how hard up he was, he always got the best masters available for me, and for Clementine. Sarah is much older, and even Clementine 5 years. I wonder what on earth you will think of it. England, I mean." He was deeply interested. "I am sure I shall love it. We have always spoken of it as home, you know. And Papa has often described my grandfather's houses. Both my grandfathers had beautiful houses, it seems, and he says now that I am rich and cannot ever be a trouble to them, the family might be pleased to see me." She spoke quite simply. There never was room for bitterness or irony in her tender heart, and Hector looked down upon her, a sort of worship in his eyes. "Papa's father is dead long ago. It is his brother who owns Beechley now," she continued. "Sir Patrick Fitzgerald. They are Irish, of course, but the place is in Cambridgeshire because it came from his grandmother." "Yes, I know the old boy," said Hector. "I see him at the turf, a fiery, vile-tempered, thin old bird, about 60. "That sounds like him," said Theodora. "And so you are going to make all these relations' acquaintance. What an experience it will be, won't it?" His voice was full of sympathy. "But you will stay in London. They are all there now, I suppose?" "My grandfather Borrington, my mother's father, never goes there, I believe. He is very old and delicate, we have heard, but I have written to him. Papa wished me to do so. For myself, I do not care, because I think he was unkind to my mother, and I shall not like him. It was cruel never to speak to her again, wasn't it? Just because she married Papa, whom she loved very much. Papa, who is so handsome that he could never have really been a husband, could he?" Then she blushed deeply, realizing what she had said. And the quaintness of it had caused Hector to smile when he felt its pathos. How could they all have sacrificed this beautiful young life between them? And he slashed off a tall green weed with his stick when he thought of Josiah Brown, his short, stumpy, plebeian figure and bald, shiny head, his common voice and his pompousness. Josiah Brown, who had now the ordering of her comings and goings, who paid for her clothes and gave her those great pearls, who might touch her and kiss her, might clasp and caress her, might hold her in his arms, his very own, any moment of the day or night. Ah, God, that last thought was impossible, unbearable. And for 1 second Hector's eyes looked murderous as they glared into the distance, and Theodora glanced up timidly and asked in a sympathetic voice, "What was it? What ailed him?" "Some day I will tell you," he said, "but not yet." Then he asked her more about her family and her plans. They would stay in London at Claridge's for a week or so, and go down to Bessington Hall for Whitsuntide. It would be ready for them then. Josiah had had it all furnished magnificently by one of those people who had taste, and ordered well for those who could afford to pay for it. She was rather longing to see it, she said, her future home, and she could have wished she might have chosen the things herself, not that it mattered much either way. "I am very ignorant about houses," she explained, "because we never really had one, you see. But I think perhaps I would know what was pretty from museums and pictures, and I love all colors and forms." He felt sure she would know what was pretty. How delightful it would be to watch her playing with his old home. The touches of her gentle fingers would make everything sacred afterwards. At last they came to the end of the green glade, and temptation again assailed him. He must ruffle the peace of her soft eyes once more. "And here is the barrier," he said, pointing to a board with "Terrain réservé" upon it, "Réservé pour la chasse de Monsieur de Président. The barrier which love keeps, and I want to take him with us as the prince and princess did in the fairy tale." "Then you must carry him all by yourself," laughed Theodora, "and he will be heavy and tire you long before we get to Versailles." This time she was on her guard, and besides, they were walking, and he was no longer caressing the edge of her dress with his wild flower. It was almost easy to fence now. But when they reached the automobile, and he bent over to tuck the rug in, and she felt the touch of his hands and perceived the scent of him, the subtle scent, not a perfume hardly, of his coat or his hair, a wild rush of that passionate disturbance came over her again, making her heart beat and her eyes dilate. And Hector saw and understood, and bit his lips, and clinched his hands together under the rug, because so great was his own emotion that he feared what he should say or do. He dared not chance a dismissal from the joy of her presence forever, after this one day. "I will wait until I know she loves me enough to certainly forgive me, and then, he said to himself. But Fate, who was looking on, laughed while she chanted, "The hour is now at hand when these steeds of passion, whose reins you have left loose so long, will not ask your leave, noble friend, but will carry you whither they will." End of chapter 10.